She leaned close, her lips curling into a smile that felt too sweet, and whispered, "A little something special for you, Evelyn. My daughter-in-law poisoned my drink at dinner, and I knew it the moment the glass touched my fingers. Betrayal doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it slides across a table in crystal glassware, rimmed with lemon, dressed up as kindness. A mother-in-law hides her darkest suspicions in silence, because who would believe her if she spoke aloud? One sip, and I might not have been sitting here at all. Silence kills marriages faster than shouting, and in that silence, I had learned to survive." She placed the glass before me, but her eyes betrayed her. One quick flick, an almost imperceptible pause, as if she were waiting for me to drink. I smiled, a smile carved from years of endurance, and rested my hand on the stem without lifting it. That's when something inside me stirred. Not panic, but clarity. A mother's instinct isn't loud, it whispers. And mine whispered that I was holding a test, not a toast. The dining room glittered with laughter, clinking cutlery, and the warm glow of candles. My son sat at the far end, oblivious, laughing at a joke his father-in-law had told. He didn't notice the tension thickening like fog around me. I kept my posture calm, elegant, as though nothing were wrong. But inside, I was counting the way she leaned back in her chair, watching, counting how her mother swirled her wine without a glance in my direction, counting seconds until I could make a choice no one would see coming. For months, I had been keeping notes, a small spiral notebook tucked away in my dresser, filled with times, dates, and the food I had eaten. I wrote down every dizzy spell, every moment of confusion, every foggy morning that felt like my mind wasn't my own. Nobody knew about it. Not my doctor, not my son, not even the woman smiling at me now. That notebook held the breadcrumbs of my reality. But tonight, I was about to find out if the story I had been writing in secret was true. I looked at her mother, seated across the table. Pearls glistened against her throat, her manicured fingers tapping the glass of wine. Sat in front of the woman who had called me useless, while the poisoned offering rested safely untouched at my place. The clinking continued, the chatter grew, and I folded my hands neatly in my lap. 35 minutes. That was the rhythm I had come to know. Every time she handed me a drink, the fog would arrive within half an hour, dragging me down into doubt and silence. Tonight, I would see if the pattern held true. Tonight, I would no longer wonder if I was losing my mind. Tonight, I would know. The minutes ticked by with excruciating calm. My son leaned in to show someone photos on his phone. Her mother bragged about investments, renovations, and vacations. My daughter-in-law laughed at every word, but her gaze flickered toward me again, sharp and watchful. I smiled back, letting her think she was in control, letting her believe I had already taken the bait. She didn't notice the faint shift of the glasses, didn't notice how her mother's hand now curled around the stem of what should have been mine. And then, almost imperceptibly, it began. A stumble in her mother's sentence, a hand pressed to her temple, a laugh that slurred at the edges. My son looked up at last, concern flashing across his face. Chairs scraped back as others asked questions. "Are you all right? Do you need some water?" The room filled with the chaos of sudden uncertainty, and through it all, I remained seated, calm, still holding the glass that should have been my undoing. People think betrayal explodes in shouts and accusations, but they're wrong. Sometimes betrayal reveals itself in silence, in the clatter of a dropped fork, in the sight of a woman gripping the edge of a table as the world tilts beneath her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply watched as the truth began to take shape in front of me. I was no longer the one trembling. I was no longer the one doubting. And for the first time in years, I knew I was not crazy. I was right. The 35 minutes were nearly up, and I could feel the shift in the air as clearly as the tightening in her mother's jaw. Voices grew frantic. Someone shouted for help, and yet my daughter-in-law sat frozen for just a moment too long. her eyes darting between her mother and me. In that silence, I understood. The game had changed. What they had planned for me was unreal to myself. I learned to move slower around her, to study the choreography of her kindness. She'd glide toward me with a coaster pinched between two fingers and say, "Hydration is health," setting down a glass with a sprig of rosemary splayed like a signature. I'd smile and leave a fingerprint on the rim without drinking. On clean days, when I cooked alone or ate at my friend Nora's, my mind felt like a just-made bed. On their days, a wrinkle always appeared. The difference became undeniable. Patterns don't lie, but people do. I shifted seats at gatherings, creating angles that let me see the kitchen pass-through and the bar cart at once. I memorized the labels on bottles, the way a cap returned crooked when fingers were rushed, the shade of lemon peel she favored. My son thought I'd become particular, the way older women get when time steals patience. I let him think that. If the cost of my safety was a reputation for fussiness, I could afford it. Fussiness survives. Credulity doesn't. And each time I refused to sip, I heard my late husband's voice. Better careful than sorry. One afternoon, I found my supplement organizer slightly rearranged. Monday's compartment closed with a snap that wasn't mine. I had always lined the tablets in the same order: white, amber, pale blue, because small rituals keep grief from pooling in corners. Now, the amber was chipped, the blue a touch chalky at its edge. I held them to my nose and caught it, a whisper of bitterness that didn't belong. I didn't take them. I placed them in a baggie, dated the label, and slid it beneath the tray liner. Nothing dramatic, just one more line in the record. The worst part wasn't the sickness. It was the doubt. Doubt is a parasite. It chews on sleep and burrows into the softest memories, asking if you've misremembered the world. I fought it with ordinary things. I watered the ferns. I ironed pillowcases. I called Nora to chat about something that wasn't me. Then I underlined my last entry, twice. If I was wrong, the worst I'd be is cautious. If I was right, caution might be the only dignity left to me in a room designed to make me small. Either way, the notebook did not roll its eyes. A small twist arrived by accident. At the pharmacy, Eli, the young technician with a cowlick that birth. She'd suggest chamomile, with a soft pat on my shoulder, and I'd ask for hot water instead. Polite sabotage became my sport. I stopped swallowing anything I hadn't opened. I marked the water level on bottles with a hair-thin pencil line. I warmed my own milk in the microwave and left the pitcher on the counter as bait. Control in thumbnails and pinpricks returned to me. I rehearsed a conversation with my son, and then I didn't have it. The words lined up and fell apart in my mouth, heavy with the old guilt of making trouble. He had always loved the peace in a room. It made him think things were fine. He confused quiet with okay. I decided not to ask him to choose between the women he'd promised to love. Love spoken over vows can be blinding. Love formed in the long night of a feverish child is a different language, less fluent in denial. I would speak mine to the only audience I could trust, posterity. On a clean day, I tested myself. I made tea with water from my kettle and a bag from a sealed box. I ate toast, not too buttery, with a scrape of jam. I walked to the library and back, returning the way I had left. Clear, steady, mind bright. It felt like sitting inside my own name again. That evening, at their table, the dimness brushed me after a single sip of her cordial. It was careful, a distant dimmer switch. But there, I let the taste sit on my tongue like a warning flare. I smiled at her and spoke about roses. I didn't finish the drink. Midway through this private war, I found proof I hadn't expected. Cleaning out the guest room drawer, I lifted the liner and discovered 2 empty blister packs I didn't recognize, tucked beneath a stack of guest towels scented with her laundry pods. The imprint codes were partial, but enough to search later with Eli's help. Anxiety medication. Sedatives if you lean on them too hard. Not contraband, not scandalous. Just dangerous in secret doses. I bagged the packs and wrote the date on another label. The drawer, precisely as before, slid shut as if it had never told on anyone. The night before the dinner, I sharpened my pencil and drew a single star at the top of a fresh that polish reality into reports. But right then there was only the quiet certainty of a pattern fulfilled, and a sharper certainty that the next battle would not be chemistry, it would be character. What happens when kindness is a mask and you have to tear it yourself? Her cruelty rarely raised its voice. It dressed itself in pearls and polite laughter. My daughter-in-law's mother could silence a room with just 5 words, words that carved into me like glass. Such a humble background, dear. That night at the engagement dinner, she said it as if she were remarking on the weather, but every syllable was a verdict. My son laughed nervously, brushing it aside, but I felt the sting settle deep. And from that moment, the two of them became a duet. Her daughter with smiles too sharp, and she with the authority of someone convinced she was untouchable. Their weapons weren't fists or shouts. They were wrapped gifts of wrinkle cream, offered with dazzling grins at Christmas. They were lessons about Google Docs, delivered as if I were a slow child instead of a woman who had worked double shifts to raise a boy into a man. Every kindness had an aftertaste. I told myself to endure for Matthew's sake. I told myself marriage would soften the edges, but edges only cut deeper when you ignore them. At the wedding, I was placed at table 6. Family sat at table 1, glowing under chandeliers while I clapped from the shadows. When my son raised his glass to thank everyone who raised me, he named a teacher, a coach, even a neighbor, but not me. That silence cracked something inside me, not with rage, but with resignation. It was as if they were rewriting my place in his story while I sat there smiling for photographs. Then came the subtle thefts of space. My favorite mug disappeared. The spot on the couch I had always claimed became cluttered with guest pillows. My visits were monitored, my words corrected, my stories interrupted by her confident laugh. My son stopped calling me Mom. He called me Evelyn, as though the name could distance us from the blood we shared. I swallowed each slight like sandpaper, rougher each time. A mini twist came one Sunday afternoon. I had baked his favorite dish, fried chicken. Memories are priceless. I excused myself, stared into the bathroom mirror, and whispered back to my reflection, "What am I doing here?" But the shift from words to something darker came quietly. After meals, I felt dizzy, my hands unsteady, my mind slipping like wet soap. The doctors found nothing. Stress, they said. Age. But my gut told me otherwise. Each time it happened, the pattern pointed back to her. When she poured, when she served, when she handed me something special. I began writing it all down. Small details, invisible bruises. If no one else would see them, at least I would. Their laughter became the backdrop of my unraveling. My son's chuckles, her polished voice, the mother's sly remarks. Each sound a brick in the wall shutting me out of my own family. But even walls have cracks. I leaned into them, listening, watching, waiting. Because somewhere inside me, I knew this wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. And if I was to survive, I'd need more than silence. I'd need proof. The cruelty wasn't just in what they did, but in how they made me doubt myself. Was I being too sensitive? Was I imagining? They were building a portrait of me as fragile, forgetful, fading. But every jab only made me sharper. Every patronizing smile only steeled my resolve. They thought they were burying me under small humiliations, but I was digging a tunnel, and that tunnel would one day lead me out. The night I placed a star at the top of a fresh notebook page, I wasn't just keeping records anymore. I was preparing for a moment that hadn't yet come. but I could feel it, circling like a hawk. I didn't know when or how, but I knew one day their cruelty would trip over its own elegance. And when it did, I would be ready to hold the silence steady until it screamed. They thought they were clever, building their plan brick by brick. But each brick was laid in plain sight. The whispers about my confusion, the way her mother leaned into conversations about early decline, the paperwork that somehow drifted into the wrong hands. It all began to show its outline. This wasn't just cruelty anymore. Politely, and I would smile, pretending I hadn't heard the blade hidden inside the silk. But those remarks weren't offhand. They were deposits, stored in the family's collective memory, building a story I hadn't agreed to. The mini twist came during a brunch I almost skipped. A lawyer, hers, not mine, happened to stop by, papers in hand, discussing guardianship as if it were a casual subject. I caught fragments: capacity, responsibility, assets. My son shifted uncomfortably, not meeting my eyes. They spoke as though I were invisible, as though I were already diminished, my voice a nuisance. When I finally stood and asked if anyone would like more coffee, the room stilled. The conversation dissolved, but I carried the echo home. Guardianship. That was their word, not mine. I knew then it wasn't just about silencing me. It was about taking what my husband and I had built. The estate, the properties, the collection of vintage cars he polished until his reflection shone in the metal. Every piece of it was in my name. They couldn't simply shove me aside. They needed justification, documents, proof that I was no longer capable of managing it. And how convenient that I was already feeling dizzy, already forgetting little things, already dependent on the kindness of a daughter-in-law who made everything special. I stared at my husband's old tools in the garage that night, hands trembling. He had always told me, paper is power. Don't sign what you don't understand. And now I understood. They wanted my signature, not my well-being. I pressed my palm against the cold steel of his toolbox and whispered, I won't let them erase me. That vow hardened into the spine of my notebook. Each new entry was no longer just record. It was defense. I tested her in small ways. I'd ask, did I already take that pill, dear? Watching her eyes flicker before she laughed it off. I'd set a cup aside untouched, then return it empty. Each time she grew bolder, certain her play was working, but she didn't realize she was feeding my record, line by line, teaching me her pattern. Proof doesn't always come from catching a hand in the words or suspicions. It comes from a moment when the lie collapses under its own weight. That moment hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it drawing closer. The trap they set for me would one day spring, only not in the way they expected. Because I was waiting, patient, silent, sharpened by humiliation into something they had underestimated all along. She wanted the stage that night, and she took it with elegance. My daughter-in-law stood from the table, smoothed her dress, and said, I've made something special just for you, Evelyn. The words dripped with sugar, but I knew the taste would be bitter. She turned toward the bar cart, her movements too rehearsed. Every slice of citrus and sprig of herb placed with ceremony. It was theater, but the audience didn't realize they were watching a play. I kept my smile soft, my eyes steady. I had waited months for this. Tonight, her ritual would betray her, not me. The drink was tall, chilled, tinted a pale pink. A sprig of rosemary floated like an ornament, a flourish to distract from the danger. She carried it across the room with a confidence that made the others admire her grace. But my gaze stayed on her hands. I remembered the chipped tablet in my pillbox, the bitterness clinging to capsules that once kept me steady. I remembered the forged renewal forms. All roads led to this glass. She set it before me and said, You're going to love it, my own recipe. My son didn't look up. No one else noticed the spotlight except me. I lifted the drink slightly, the condensation cool against my fingers, and set it back down. She watched, pretending to join in laughter at another end of the table, but her eyes flicked back, hungry, expectant. It was the same flicker I had seen before, the signal she couldn't control. For anyone else, it was a blink. For me, it was a red flare. I folded my hands in my lap, still and calm. If this was her proof, then it was also mine. The foreshadowing I had carried in my notebook circled back like a hawk. 35 minutes. That was always the window. Tonight would be no different, except the glass wasn't mine anymore. I waited for the room's rhythm to shift, for the chatter to swell enough to mask a small exchange. Her mother, perched up, smiled back, warm and soft, as if to say, "I see you now." A mini twist cracked the mask. My son asked me about the apple crisp I had brought. I answered lightly, describing the cinnamon, the buttery crust, but my daughter-in-law froze. She hated apple crisp. I knew she'd never touch it. I'd brought it not as dessert, but as a reminder. There are traditions she couldn't erase, recipes she couldn't claim. My words were casual, but her eyes betrayed the irritation beneath. She knew I had played my own move long before the glasses touched the table. The room carried on. Forks scraped plates. Conversations drifted from stocks to vacations. And all the while, 35 minutes ticked forward like a drumbeat only I could hear. My daughter-in-law's laugh grew thinner, less anchored. She checked her phone too often, her gaze darting between her mother and me. I tilted my head as if curious, but inside I was steady. Tonight wasn't her rehearsal anymore. Tonight, she was the one being tested. Every sip her mother took was a sentence in a confession she hadn't yet spoken. And when the signs began, they would speak louder than any accusation I could make. My role was simple, to sit in silence, to let them reveal themselves. Proof doesn't need a voice. Proof needs only time. But time is cruel to liars. As the clock neared its mark, I folded my napkin slowly, carefully, as though preparing for dessert. No one noticed. They were too busy laughing at a joke about golf, too distracted by the pretense of family harmony. Only she noticed me. Only she saw my calm. And that calm was the one thing she couldn't control. The first symptom would come soon. I didn't need to rush, didn't need to force it. 35 minutes was a truth I had lived too many times to doubt. Tonight, the truth would belong to everyone else in the room. And when it did, there would be no denying it. The question was, would my son see it as clearly as I did? Or would he cling to the woman who had been serving him poison, wrapped in charm? Her mother was in the middle of a story about the marble countertops in her forward, her perfect composure cracking at the edges. "Mom, are you all right?" she asked, voice too bright, too quick. Concern, yes, but rehearsed, like lines spoken on a stage she hadn't prepared for. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my expression calm. The glass sat untouched before me, a pale pink reflection of her intention. Proof, clear and cold, and no one knew it yet. The shift was unmistakable now. Her mother gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. She tried to stand, but the chair scraped back violently as her legs buckled. Gasps erupted. Chairs scraped. Silverware rattled against plates. My son rushed to her side, steadying her as she stumbled. Her lips were pale, her breath shallow. The panic bloomed across the room like spilled ink. A mini twist turned the air colder. As her mother collapsed back into the chair, a sharp, bitter smell rose from the glass she had been drinking. It wafted across the table, faint but undeniable. and I saw my daughter-in-law's eyes widen in recognition. She glanced at me, then at the glass still sitting untouched at my place. Her throat tightened, her jaw clenched. She knew what had happened, and for the first time, fear leaked into her eyes. Voices shouted for help. Someone dialed 911. My son's voice cracked as he tried to calm his mother-in-law, who groaned incoherently, her body swaying. My daughter-in-law fumbled with her phone, her hands trembling so badly the screen nearly slipped from her fingers. Her mask of elegance was gone. In its place stood a woman cornered by her own scheme. I rose slowly, not rushing, not drawing attention, just enough to reach for the glass. I held it gently, as though it were fragile, sacred. My son looked up, confusion etched into his face. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked. I met his eyes and said plainly, "This is the drink she gave me." The words cut through the chaos like a bell. My daughter-in-law froze, the color draining from her cheeks. The room erupted again, but I stayed still. Paramedics arrived, moving with quick efficiency, laying her mother... Ma'am. The air was thick with silence once the ambulance doors closed, carrying her mother away. My son stood, pale, hollow, his eyes darting between me and his wife. He didn't recognize either of us in that moment, and perhaps he was right. His wife was no longer the woman he thought she married, and I was no longer the quiet mother who endured in silence. I had waited 35 minutes, and in those 35 minutes the truth had revealed itself. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning of what they had tried to hide. What would the test show? What would the reports reveal? The silence in the room told me one thing. Whatever story they had built around me was starting to crumble. And when walls crack, the collapse is only a matter of time. The hospital smell clung to my clothes long after I returned home. Sterile air, antiseptic wipes, the faint sting of chemicals that made my stomach churn. Her mother lay in a curtained room, pale and trembling, while machines hummed softly. The doctors whispered about toxins, about unexplained reactions. They drew blood, ran tests, and when the first results came back, I felt the weight of months of doubt slip from my shoulders. Benzodiazepines. Not prescribed, not accidental, deliberate. The officer who had taken my notebook met me in the waiting area. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed gravity. "We'll need to keep this as evidence, Mrs. Hayes. Your notes are remarkably detailed." He paused, almost reluctant. "They match the timeline of what we found in her system." I nodded, silent, my fingers folded tightly together. Every word I had scribbled in the margins of that notebook had transformed from paranoia into proof. My son sat across from me, head in his hands. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, rocking forward as if he could shake reality loose. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't." His voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to comfort him, to pull him into the embrace I used to give him when nightmares woke him as a child. But he wasn't a child anymore, and the nightmare wasn't his imagination. It was his wife. The mini twist came when she walked into the waiting room, her face scrubbed of the usual polish, hair pulled back hastily, eyes red as though she had been crying. She approached the officer with hands outstretched, voice breaking. "Things I was protecting us. Protecting you." But the more she spoke, the more the silence around her grew heavy. Damning. The toxicology report arrived within hours. Benzodiazepines, the kind used for sedation. The dosage was not therapeutic. It was manipulative. Enough to disorient. Enough to cloud judgment. Enough to make someone seem unreliable, confused. I watched the officer fold the paper neatly, slide it into a folder, and place it under his arm. It was no longer just suspicion. It was science. Her mother, barely able to keep her eyes open, whispered from the bed, "You said it was just a supplement." The words cut through the room like glass shattering. My daughter-in-law froze, her lips parted but empty. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. The officer turned to me. "You said you'd been keeping notes for months?" I nodded. Every episode, every symptom, every meal. He exhaled, slow, measured. Then you may have just saved your own life. My son buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. He had always believed love meant trust, but now that trust had fractured under the weight of evidence. He whispered, almost to himself, "How do I choose between the woman I married and the mother who raised me?" The question was raw, unanswerable. I didn't speak. There are no words when truth finally claws its way to the surface. There is only silence, heavy and sharp, filling the space between mother and son, between husband and wife, between predator and prey. And in that silence, I knew the war wasn't over. Confessions can be twisted, excuses spun, but the blood test didn't lie. The question was no longer whether she had poisoned me. It was how far she and her mother had planned to go. As dawn broke, painting the hospital windows in pale gray, the officer leaned closer to me and said, "This isn't just about tonight. We'll need to look deeper. Medical records, financial documents, anything that shows motive." I nodded. I already knew what they would find, but part of me trembled at the thought. What else had they hidden that I had yet to uncover? The courtroom wasn't where this story ended, but it was where the correspondence. It was like puzzle pieces snapping together with cruel precision. My son sat frozen, eyes wide as each document was projected across the courtroom screen. He shifted forward as if to stand, but stayed seated, trapped between disbelief and horror. When asked for her defense, my daughter-in-law tried to paint herself as misunderstood. She spoke of anxiety, of sleepless nights, of a desperate attempt to keep peace in a fractured family. She insisted the substances were harmless, that I had exaggerated symptoms, that I was lonely and suspicious. But then came the question that pierced through the theater. If it was harmless, why didn't you drink it yourself? The silence that followed was heavier than any testimony. The judge ordered further inquiry into my estate, into the legal petitions quietly drafted months earlier. There it was, in black and white. Forms nearly ready to file, signatures prepared, affidavits suggesting I was unfit to manage my affairs. My own daughter-in-law had written, "She forgets names, loses track of time, unsafe to be alone." It wasn't just about sedatives, it was about erasure, legal, permanent, undeniable. At night, I sat by my window replaying it all. The dinners, the soft smiles, the carefully wrapped gifts meant to humiliate. And I realized the pills were only half the weapon. The other half was narrative. They hadn't just wanted me weak, they wanted me unbelievable. A character in their story, a relic fading into irrelevance. That was the deeper poison, the one no toxicologist could measure. The looped curiosity came when the detective returned to me after court. He leaned against the rail outside, his voice low. "There's more, Mrs. Hayes. Financial records, overseas transfers, shell companies in both their names. It looks bigger than inheritance. It looks orchestrated." His words chilled me. If the pills were only the beginning, what else had they already set in motion? And so I asked myself, how many more lies had been waiting in the shadows? And how many more betrayals would surface once the digging went deeper? The storm I had braced for finally broke open on a night I will never forget. It wasn't inside a courtroom or a hospital. It was in the quiet of my own. Tucked between the pages was the true cliffhanger. Forged documents, power of attorney papers, already drafted, with his signature practiced in shaky repetition until it looked real. The mini twist hit harder when he admitted he hadn't believed me before. Not fully. He confessed he had thought I exaggerated, that maybe grief had warped my judgment. But then, when she disappeared for days, he went looking. He found a locked drawer in their study, and in that drawer, he found the folder now lying between us. Evidence of a plan, not just to erase me, but to drain him as well. His voice cracked. She was never protecting me. She was using me. I listened in silence, the air heavy with betrayal. The same son who had doubted me now looked at me with eyes full of shame, searching for forgiveness. I wanted to give it, but another part of me burned with the knowledge that he had chosen blindness until the poison touched him too. Still, the evidence was undeniable. They hadn't only plotted against me. They had hollowed out the very foundation of his life. The cliffhanger came sharp and cruel when his phone buzzed on the table. A message lit the screen. One line. From her. If you don't keep quiet, I'll make sure your mother pays the price anyway. His face went pale, and in that instant, I knew the war wasn't just over inheritance or health. It was still alive, still vicious, and it had no intention of ending quietly. Looped curiosity pressed against my chest as I asked myself, if she was willing to threaten him even now, what storm was waiting just beyond the horizon? And how far was she willing to go to finish what she started? The final chapter of this storm did not roar with noise. It unfolded in quiet clarity, the kind that comes after years of being silenced and doubted. I had carried the weight of betrayal, the sting of humiliation, and the fear of being erased. Yet in the end, it wasn't vengeance that gave me peace. It was choosing my own path, one that no one else could rewrite. I rewrote my will with deliberate hands. The ink was steady, the decisions clear. My son and his wife be both protective and enduring. When I sealed the envelope with the letter meant for her, I felt the sharp edge of closure. In that letter, I didn't recount every betrayal. I told her about strength, about listening to the small voice inside that warns when something is wrong, about the courage to walk away when staying means losing yourself. It was not a warning, but a gift. My son visited one last time. He stood on my porch, eyes wet, words fumbling. He asked if forgiveness was possible, if bridges could be rebuilt. I looked at him and saw both the boy who once held my hand and the man who had let go when I needed him most. My answer was neither cruel nor soft. It was honest. Some wounds close, Matthew. Some don't. Time will decide which this is. He nodded, and for once he didn't argue. He simply walked away, shoulders bent under the weight of consequences. The house felt lighter after he left. I packed a small bag, moved to a modest cottage by the sea, and let the sound of waves replace the echoes of old arguments. I planted herbs, cooked meals for myself, and found peace in routines untouched by deceit. The silence no longer suffocated me. It became a friend, a proof of survival. But the true ending came not in solitude, but in rediscovery. At the community center where I volunteered, I listened to strangers tell their stories of hardship, betrayal, resilience. Their voices reminded me that my suffering was not singular, that pain shared becomes lighter, and that healing often arrives quietly. They didn't know me as the woman almost erased by her daughter-in-law. They knew me as Evelyn, the one who listened, who believed, who showed up. The cliffhanger had already passed. What remained was the lesson. You cannot always choose what others do to you, but you can choose what you become after. I became whole again, not because justice was served in a courtroom, but because I reclaimed my story in silence and strength. And now, to you listening, I ask, how many times have you ignored your instincts for the sake of keeping peace? How often have you stayed quiet when you should have spoken? This story is not just mine, it's a mirror, reflecting back the choices we all face when love collides with betrayal. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Share your thoughts in the comments, your own stories of resilience, the lessons betrayal has taught.